Right, we are live now. Um, all right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us on this fourth session in the series, which is called "Is Just Culture Desirable for Learning?" Uh, we'll do a quick round and introduction with our panelists, and then we will get into the discussion. The idea really is to explore this relationship between just culture and learning in this series, and we'll take about 45 minutes or so. And then we will take questions from the audiences. So please feel free if you have any questions, leave them in the comment box. I'll pick them up and then I'll ask them from the panelists. So, Rosa, would you like to give a very light introduction of yourself? I think most people know you. It'd be nice to just very little introduction. Yes.
Just very brief. Thank you. Um, yes, I'm very happy to be here. I am right now in Long Beach, California. It's 7 a.m. and there's a lot of fog. So I'm very anxious to hear what my colleagues have to say about learning and just culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. Steve, hello, Steve.
Hi all. Yeah, my name's Stephen Shorrock. I work primarily in air traffic management and aviation, generally, very often with air traffic controllers, and in the sphere of just culture with pilots also, and the European judiciary, safety specialists up to kind of CEO level, talking about these kinds of things that we're going to talk about today. That's one of the things that I do.
Thank you. Yes. Tanya, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, Nippin. So I echo Rosa's excitement about being in this panel. And I normally introduce myself as coming from the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, which is otherwise known as Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I have been fascinated by this whole shift in the safety world, including this whole nomenclature on just culture.
Great. Thank you. Carsten?
Thanks. Carsten Busch is my name. I'm located in Norway, and just a bit of trivia, it's snowing outside. Yay! I've been working for the past 7 years with occupational safety and health in the police force. Totally different background, more engineering where I come from. And besides my daytime job in the police, I'm involved in the human factors and system safety program at Lund University. And well, I think just culture is a very interesting subject to discuss because I remember that it was both the 97 Reason book and then 10 years later Sidney Decker's book on just culture, which really put me on the, well, let's say safety nerdiness track. Thanks for inviting me with these fantastic people.
Thank you. Maybe Carsten, we can start with you because it looks like you have a lot to say. Safety nerdiness, I hear the word. So how do you view the idea of a just culture?
I try to explain it quite often in my own organization, and then we always stress the difficulty of achieving just culture, which is a quite difficult term, I think, because it's not about culture at all. It's about organizational justice, really. And I tend to use the common sense definition that Reason, I think, started with, which is it's the balance. On one side, you are allowed to make mistakes, and you even need to make mistakes because it's how we learn, by trial and error, or that's one of the modes of learning, at least. On the other side, we cannot accept everything. And especially working with police officers puts that sometimes on the edge because, society expects just a bit more of police, and it's very hard to find where is this balance, because I think it's very human that we often immediately lash out to we cannot accept this kind of a reaction before we are able to take the step back and think, okay, but here's so much going on, so this is not really blameworthy, and we probably need to make this mistake to learn. And so it's a balance. It's a very difficult balance.
Okay, it's a nice way to articulate it. Um, Thank you, Carsten. We'll go to Rosa. Rosa, what's your view on this idea of just culture?
Well, I I believe that a just culture, it consists of trust, learning, and accountability, and it protects people from who make honest mistakes from being viewed as villains, culpable. The problem, sort of what Carsten is referring to, what's the difference between an honest mistake and a willful act? And that's where I find most people struggle. And there's no black and white answer to it. And it seems to depend on your assumptions or your biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious, about the person that made the mistake. And this has been shown through a lot of research that when teachers and even researchers assume the best about their subjects perform much better. So there's a whole aspect of just culture that is never really discussed, which is the conscious and unconscious bias. And then again, we can relate it to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there's certain portions of the population that have never been in a just culture. So why is it that they have been able to learn? That's an interesting question. When I looked up the definition of learning, I got 10 billion hits. 10 billion. That surprised me. And from what just a summary of my findings was that learning is a process that leads to change, which occurs as a result of experience and increases the potential for improved performance and future learning. And I have to say, because I'll reveal a little bit of myself personally, because I was not raised in a psychologically safe environment, which is basically what we're talking about here in today's hot word, psychological safety. Your learning capacity leads to your ability to adapt and survive. And I grew up in a very threatening environment, which I adapted to and survived. And you can see the result. Here I am. Let me know if I'm over 3 minutes.
Keep going.
So the connection to psychological safety is very strong, but fairness is only one characteristic of that, okay, which is what just culture seems to be about. But there are many, many other aspects that have to be in place in order for people to learn. And so focusing, we look for simple answers such as the golden rules. Okay, now everybody knows the rules. And if you stay in between these rails, you will be safe. But no, it just isn't true, because the unspoken elephant in the room are politics and power. And the fact that they are frequently behind the scenes pushing people to make decisions in the direction that isn't necessarily safe.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the unconscious biases, and then you and Carsten talk about this tension between honest mistakes and willful negligence. So, how much control do you have on something that is totally unconscious? That's an interesting one to explore. But we'll go to Stephen first and hear his view. Steve, what do you think about the idea of just culture?
It's clearly like one of these multidimensional things, right? Because there's many conceptions of justice, including two major types of retributive and restorative. There's many conceptions of culture as well, but we're talking about at least something that's roughly shared in a group of some kind of size. So shared ways of thinking and shared ways of doing at a most basic level. But then that's at many levels. So we can talk at the level of a family, which is probably quite a useful place to start, because this is the most uncodified, aspect of culture in a family, where there's no safety management system, there's no written laws. Going up through school, where now it starts to be more formalized, going up then into organizations, and societies more generally, where we have laws and we have concepts of justice, all of those. And I think then so when we talk about just culture, we need to know what level we're talking about. Typically, we're talking about organizations. In my work, we're also talking about more at the kind of legal level, because an organization exists in a context. So it exists, it has to obey the law. So it makes it difficult, because you might have what you think is a just culture in an organization, but it still has to comply with the nation's laws, which may have particular laws on, for instance, errors and outcomes. And so you cannot separate it from a systems point of view. But I think at a very basic level, the idea is that if you just take the concept of a family and justice within a family, what's reasonable? Is it reasonable to punish a child for dropping a cup, for instance? And then you can go up through some kind of examples to, is it reasonable to punish a child for stealing something from a neighbor? Something like that, when they know that this is wrong, perhaps. So, we grow up with this idea of justice, and we grow up with this idea of shared values within a family, within a neighborhood, and within a country, and so on. So I think all we've done in the organizational setting is try to somehow formalize this, because there are so many gray areas. And the idea of an honest mistake raises the idea of, well, what is a dishonest mistake? That makes no sense. There's just either. So then we're struggling to know, when is it reasonable to take some kind of punitive action from the retributive side, for instance, in cases of bullying, for instance, in cases of perhaps racial abuse, something like that, that might happen in a work setting. But also, how can we use justice to heal in the restorative sense? And then how can we use all of this to actually learn? And that's the question you want to ask today, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting dimension, because I think from what you're saying, and I can clearly see where you're heading. Well, at least I think I do. But I think when we talk about learning, probably this will start to make a little bit more sense, because in the way you understand learning, of course. But let's go to Tanya and see what Tanya has to say.
So I think when I echo Carsten that I probably was introduced to the term just culture through Sidney Decker's book. I can remember the opening chapter of the nurse being in the defense docket, and wait a minute, where's my nurse manager? Where are my colleagues? Where's the system behind me that was implicated in this event? And I remember that being very impactful in the way that he wrote that. But I also remember in my podcast listener mode, listening to various podcasts on the pre-accident investigation podcast, where just culture became a label that companies were using in a retributive way. And I realized, okay, this is a lot more difficult than it was presented initially. Maybe part of this is because of our addiction to binary thinking. Is this, a a willful act or an honest mistake. Like it's not that simple most of the time to be able to talk about this. I'd like to pick up on something that Stephen Shorrock had mentioned. There are some. I was just listening to another podcast where ethical decision making was being looked at, and the guest had said that there are some areas where we do have to be more binary in our thinking, and she talked about racism. I'd like to just bring up a story that's happening in my community right now. There was a hockey game. There was a black player on the ice. He was called various names that I won't repeat. This got into the local media, and so a lot of the media wanted to talk to the head of the team, the head of the league. What are you going to do about this? And it came down to, well, if a referee didn't hear the offensive terms, then we don't really know what happened. The mother said, well, I'd like to mic my son so that he would be able to, but that's not legal, as Stephen was saying. Like there are higher laws that we have to be aware of here. But when they did talk to the coach, he said, well, once we find that kid, he will be expelled. He will be punished. And I thought, okay, what learning is happening here? This is exclusively retributive justice. We're not going into any kind of restorative understanding of what motivated that kid to say what he said. And when I realized that if 12-year-olds are being taught this today, how on earth are we going to get to a better place in the future?
Excellent. Thank you. There's a lot in what you said, but I just wanted to unpack one thing before we go back to Carsten. Is that a lot of times what you hear is we will, for example, the situation that you mentioned, that you do an independent assessment and you try and find out where has the system failed. And the problem is that with that kind of an approach, what you're really trying to do is you're allocating blame elsewhere. And so if it's not the frontline worker, it could be the CEO, or it could be so I still struggle to understand how the systems, because we talk about just culture, but then we fall back into systems and structures. And this is where I find the idea of both just and culture very, very powerful. But we'll explore that as we go. So where is the real learning when we are finding somebody? It's just dressing it into another. Well, it's just positioning blame elsewhere in the so-called system. So what has really changed as a result of that? Going back to Rosa's point, if learning is about change, what change has happened as a result of this? Interesting. Thank you, Tanya. Very, very powerful example also. Go back to Carsten now. Carsten, feel free if you have anything else to say, but my next question would be to explore, what is learning in your world? What does it mean?
Well, I haven't Googled it and read 10 million hits, but on a common sense level, I tend to connect learning with improvement. That we can see better ways of doing things, maybe new ways of doing things. And we didn't get really homework for this, but you made me think because we often connect, and it is perhaps because of James Reason, who defined safety culture as these 5 different or 5 interconnected subcultures: reporting culture and just culture and learning culture. That we connect just culture with learning, the learning aspect instinctively, and So you got me thinking, but why do we take this, let's say, utilitarian view at just culture at all, or at accidents? Because we often talk about accidents. Well, something bad happened, and now we must learn from this because somebody got hurt, and out of respect and blah blah. And we have probably a lot of other arguments. But when I think of just culture, we often, I think, we try to sell it to someone as being this is necessary for learning, and in a way, perhaps it is, because we often think you can only learn about things that you know about. So if people are afraid to report because they know they get punished, which is one of the effects of not having this just culture or psychological safety. So then we don't know, and so it's a prerequisite. But on the other, well, I got thinking, and I don't have an answer to this. But why do we need to sell this in this way? Because nobody is going to say, we need to have fair trials because else we don't learn from crime. Or whatever. It's just, well, we are living in a democracy, so we shall have fair trials, and you're not guilty until proven otherwise. But when it comes to organizations, first we need to sell this in, and then all the, I think Stephen talked about this, all these levels. Is it regulated or not? And in organizations, it's often not regulated at all, because you don't have the protection from which you would have if you drove too fast, for example, and you are getting a fee or whatever. Did this make sense? It was a bit of rambling, but you really got me thinking, and I don't have any answers, but you provided me with a lot of interesting questions here.
It's a very positive.
I hope that someone else can shine some light on it.
Sure. Before we go to Rosa, the thing that really interested me in what you were saying was that you're trying to promote the idea of just culture, and there is already a mental image or an expectation that learning will lead to some sort of change and some sort of improvement. Maybe not. Maybe there is no need for any improvement. Maybe the status quo is serving well. And when I say improvement, and you put politics at the heart of it, improvement comes from working harder, trying harder, often from people who are serving the hierarchy. So I'm not sure if an organization, if at the level of setting expectation, we are coming up with this idea that learning means change or learning means improvement, because I hear it a lot of times, and I don't know if learning will always result in change or improvement. Maybe sometimes not.
And if I can just add another element, we tend to approach bad things happening with this focus on learning and improvement. But it's not the only view. There's this great paper by Sidney Dekker from 2014 or 15, where it discusses the psychology of incident investigation, and then discusses 4 different goals with incident investigation. And I think it's just brilliant to look through those 4 lenses, and then you have almost automatically to conclude it's going to be very hard to satisfy everyone. Because these 4 views are often conflicting. You cannot understand and prevent and restore something and explain the suffering that happened, and follow up the moral outrage that there is. Well, somebody got hurt, so we have to punish someone. That's very primal human reaction. So you have to balance these different goals, and that's probably very hard. And maybe an organization will decide, well, we don't want to really learn from this, because our reputation is much more important right now. I don't know who am I to decide here.
Well, precisely because you use the word repetition. Repetition is important, I think. If you look at the work of Soren Kierkegaard, the more you repeat, the more you get better at learning. And you improve your ability to contextualize something, explain something, articulate it well. So there is no rush to go and change things and improve them. Maybe you just need to build on what you already have. And so I think that's an expectation that we set up against the idea of the just culture. Maybe, but going to Rosa now. Rosa, instead of asking you the question about what does learning mean, maybe you can help me articulate when was it in your vast experience in consulting and teaching and writing, you felt that movement where learning happened? You saw an example of learning. What would that be in your view?
Well, okay. I think of learning at different levels. First of all, organizations don't learn, systems don't learn, people learn. And then those learnings then get put into norms and so on and so forth. That's how the psychological process operates. So my learning for myself has always been, it's constant, and it does change. Learning is change because it somehow changes your perception of the world. So I remember when I first learned about culture, Carsten and I have something in common in that we really feel that the term safety culture is quite useless. Because very few people understand what a culture is. So most people just use it as a junk drawer. Oh, that's a safety culture problem. Now we'll bring in a consultant and forget about it. But so I remember, though, when I first learned about the unspoken assumptions and beliefs and how those control society, I said, oh my gosh, I've been living under the tyranny of other people's beliefs and expectations about me, and I don't have to live there anymore. I mean, that's like a huge transformation. And since that, I have gone into organizations and I've tried to transmit that moment and say, you do not have to live, you don't have to suffer. You don't have to live in these tyrannic environments, just as Viktor Frankl didn't have to do it in the concentration camp, because you have control over how you feel. And as I listened to the panel, you all seem to be taking this position from a safety organizational point of view. And I think that the profession needs to pay a lot more attention to what happens at the individual level and the social level and the interaction. Because, Carsten, my latest insight is that culture is created through personal interaction. And that is how it's maintained or broken. Because you can see how a new leader that comes in and starts treating people with respect and following these aspirations of just culture, that the culture suddenly begins to change. I have seen it over and over again at the team level, because there's a leader within that team structure, and at an organizational level, because a general manager, I've never experienced a CEO that did that, although I hear that Alcoa's CEO, Paul McO'Neill, was able to do that through the power of his influence. So I don't know if I'm probably not answering your question, but when I go into organizations or I'm coaching, and I'll say something such as, your influence is in the power of your relationships. And then we start exploring that idea. I see that learning of that individual who begins to practice those things of relationship building, trust, respect, psychological safety. I see them transform, and I see their teams transform. So learning is a very important aspect of that, because many of us were raised in a very I shouldn't say non-learning. We're constantly learning, even in oppressive environments. We have to learn to survive. Learning has nothing to do with just culture. Learning has to do with adaptation. So there we are, and so we can continue to learn whether or not there's a just culture. The question is a leader willing to adapt him or herself to these concepts so that they can experience more success and have a higher level of well-being in the organization? And that's for the leader who cares about employee well-being. Not every leader has that focus.
Thank you, Rosa. I I don't know if I agree with you, but I really like your idea. I'm intrigued by the ideas because one of the things that comes to mind is that um, as we move from the family where we are nurtured and taken care of and put into a formal education system to use the word, I think that's where the whole anti-learning starts. So I think everything that starts from that point onwards to the point where you go to a school, to a university, to organization is very, very anti-learning. So it all against the idea of learning. And I was also very intrigued by the use of the word adaptation. Yes, that's precisely what we do. We adapt because there is pressure on us, but there is no real learning. There is no real inner movement, bodily movement. And it's but we'll return to that, Rosa. Yes, a very, very interesting concept. Yes. Stephen, would you like to say something?
Me?
Myself.
Stephen,
Myself.
yes.
Stephen.
I was just going to ask Stephen about what's your view on learning, Stephen. What do you think?
Well, we learn regardless of, any kind of justice. We learn all of the time. There's a kind of traction, right? So, and there's a deepening of understanding or a changing of understanding, and there's multiple perspectives all of the time. And so we're going to learn regardless. It's a case of what we learn and by whom, I suppose. And I guess the idea of just culture, at least at the corporate level, is learning about events and associated conditions and learning then how to improve. That's the kind of intention. I think there's a lot of what goes on in the background is actually learning about norms, about what is acceptable around here. I think that's the strong undercurrent of that is influenced by every reaction when things go wrong, whether there's an accident or incident or not, simply if someone makes a mistake, and that may be working outside of the norm. So you work outside the group. And my feeling, talking to really hundreds, thousands probably of air traffic controllers, engineers, and so on, and then more lately, prosecutors, is that the people that frontline workers are afraid of most are not the people at whom the idea of just culture is directed. So just culture is directed typically at safety people and people in management positions. At least in industries like mine, air traffic controllers are not really afraid of those people. And fear is at the heart of this. It's intricately involved in learning. They're afraid of each other. They're afraid of their colleagues. And something happens, and I think it happens certainly in healthcare as well, and probably many other sectors, that blame is kind of externalized to people like investigators, prosecutors, whoever, right? But then within the closed shop, the conversation is different. So we have to talk about that taboo as well, I think, and the issue of norms. Learning and justice both having common consequences, because events have consequences, actions have consequences, and we learn based on consequences. You can't learn if you don't have feedback or knowledge of results. Basic kind of psychological theory, I suppose. And so there's a connection for sure, but it's a case of what are we learning and who's learning what.
Yes, I recall from this discussion there was RJ last time who mentioned this idea of local ingenuity and how can we learn and institutionalize local ingenuity. So you see a case of improvisation on the ground, and then how can you put it back into the system? And to him, that was a telling example of just culture. But as I'm hearing from you, and this is my experience also, that how much of that ingenuity will be appreciated by the colleagues at the lateral level before you even take it to the level of at the top and want people to formalize it, because one, we don't have a language for ingenuity or improvisation. It's very murky, it's very gray, it's very greasy, it's not black and white, as Tanya said. So are we really prepared to go into that uncertain zone? Because and this is keeps repeating, Stephen. I do workshops on accidents, and particularly the Costa Concordia event. The most unforgiving people are actually the people who come from the industry, who understand the murky details. And I can understand that, because a lot of the learning which should come from the unconscious is coming from the conscious. The conscious mind is stopping them to learn anything. So that's a very powerful thing. I don't know. So to me, a lot of learning has to come from the unconscious, because that's where we make most of our decisions also from. But interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Tanya, yes, Rosa.
Well, I just dying to, Stephen, and maybe we can come back to it, but you
No,
dropped a bomb. You said that they're afraid of each other. And there it is, that interpersonal interaction in that moment. And that's what maintains the culture right there. So after Tanya speaks, I hope we can come back to that, because that's an amazing statement.
Yeah, I think just very, very briefly, again, going back to our family of origin, what do we fear most? We fear losing the love and approval of those closest to us. You know, when we're little kids, you know, and then when we grow into our families as professionals, then we fear being ejected from the group. We don't fear investigating. We can work around them, and we'll come together to work around them. But we have to maintain the integrity of the group. The first principle.
Rosa, would you like to say something there?
Well, no, I'm glad I asked that question, because I didn't know, but I completely agree with it. And it goes back to that psychological safety, doesn't the importance of belonging? And not the way that Amy Edmondson uses the word, but the broader meaning of psychological safety, which is to be included and to belong. And that's the unconscious need, Nippin, that we all live within, and that drives our decisions, unless we become more self-aware and say, this is triggering this reaction, and I don't have to go there. But otherwise, I just go there without even thinking about it. And so we have baked in the kinds of responses and results that we can get in that system, right? Wow, Stephen, have you published on that?
I think I just wrote one post once. I don't bother going through, formal publishing nowadays, the machine of publishing houses. But I just wrote something called "Who Are We Most Afraid Of?" Just culture. Who are we most afraid of? Something like that. Some years ago.
Okay, I'd love to have the link to that.
Rosa, what triggered this series was a conference that I attended on the idea of just culture and learning, where you had ship masters coming from all over the world, flying business class, put into the best of hotels, coming to the conference and listening to a captain who had made a mistake and expecting an apology from him. That was learning. So and then when you go into personal groups and you sit with them and you ask them, so what do you think? They would say, well, we would have done the same thing. But this is how, this is the conscious and the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind wants to give you the gift of learning, but the conscious mind comes in the way and say, no, we will not do that. We will never do that. We will never behave like him. He's an idiot. So interesting. Yes.
Yes, it
Tanya.
is.
Yes. Tanya, what do you think?
So I think one thing that you had said, Nippin, is really insightful, and I've heard you talk about your your doctoral experience and how when you were challenged, that was probably the first time that you realized, this is what learning is. I was confronted with a talk at the former HPRCT conference a couple of years ago, where Bob Nelms had talked about a whole investigation that he did in the 80s in Fort McMurray, Alberta, of all places. And you had the normal story of the investigative team having groupthink and believing that this guy was had committed an infraction and needs to be punished and all this kind of thing. And then he has a long story about it, but they brought in some computer nerd in 1982, so there weren't too many of them at that time, and he didn't see what they saw, and he called them out on, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, and and all this kind of thing, and it started to really change the way that the investigation proceeded, and that and they ended up putting on parkas and going to see exactly how this guy did his work for the first time ever, like looking at work as done. And obviously this team, who otherwise sat in offices and had heating and all this kind of thing, did not ever understand the so-called blue line. And this was the first time that they were confronted with it. And Bob Nelms talked about it literally hurting. Their brains hurt because they knew what happened. And this was this supreme cognitive dissonance. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean he has to climb up 4 flights? What do you mean he has to hold on to? What do you mean that this isn't my worldview? This isn't how I understood the world to work. And I think when you had said that schooling is a large part of this, because we get entrenched in a model of learning that is more, regurgitation than it is anything else. That it's not actually challenging your worldview and getting you to appreciate different perspectives and getting you to actually start to think about things. I know that just one other point I wanted to make is that I know that Carsten, I've been on forums with Carsten where he has said, if you want to learn about culture, get rid of the word. It's the word that's obstructing you getting to anything of value here. I don't know how often anthropologists and ethnographers use the word culture when they're doing their work, but they're doing culture the way that we see it. And they are very self-aware, as Rosa said. They're very transparent about how their own upbringing, their own environment might be influencing the way that they do their work. And they have supreme listening skills. They know how to listen, which is something that I think the traditional schooling doesn't necessarily teach us. So maybe just some of that is part of this, and that unless we can start to get out of the safety field in the way that it is being traditionally taught in didactic classrooms and all this kind of thing, we're probably not going to get to a better place, because there's something in the structure of how that whole paradigm works that isn't getting to the learning that I think we're talking about, the just culture that I think we're talking about.
Thank you. If I may say, it was very, very insightful and very powerful and hit my heart, which is where all the learning comes from. But anyway, the thing that I found interesting in what you said, two things actually stood out to me. One is that schooling, training, taming, education has nothing to do with learning, to me at least, in my mind. There is no connection with learning. The other thing you talked about, the anthropology and anthropologist, is that I think in this worldview of just culture and systems thinking, we are still trying to locate the truth outside. The truth exists outside of us. Whereas what Rosa also alluded to in some ways, and you also did, I think the truth is very subjective. The truth is what it means to me. And I think that's very, very important for learning, because I could give you hundreds of examples of atrocities that are happening in organizations and around the world. But how does that matter to you? What does that mean to you? Would it create any movement or any change within you? And I think that's where marketing and sales and Netflix movies, we can learn awful lot from them. That in the first 15 seconds we decide whether we really want to spend the next 2 hours on this or not. And we are so far away from that in the safety world because we are so fixated on the idea of rationalist thinking. Thank you, Tanya. That's very helpful. Carsten will now start to summarize this discussion. I'm becoming this is a wonderful discussion. How would you answer the question? And tell me if it's a rubbish question, but anyway, I will ask it. Do you think just culture is desirable for learning? What's your view on that?
I think a just culture is desirable because we want to be treated fairly, and I think we should do so with others. And if we learn, it's probably a bonus. So that's one answer that I would like to offer. I don't think we do need to connect the two, and we also probably should be reluctant to put an equation mark or we must learn because maybe it's not the most important thing at the time. Am I allowed to take just a step back to what we talked about before you asked me the question? Because I think that was a really interesting thing. And some months ago, I read up a bit on risk communication and the work of Peter Sandman, which is freely available online, which I think is brilliant stuff. And he has some really I think they're often very funny lectures on YouTube. So just if you have an hour, look him up, Peter Sandman, and he talks about how we often tend to approach learning and communication in safety, which is this teacher model where we provide information, then we think, well, now you know the truth. And you will change your attitude and you will change behavior, and that's it. And then you mentioned Netflix and advertisers. He says what's really effective is what advertisers do, because they present you something and then they make you want that thing, even though it's probably unhealthy for you, but you want it because, well, smoking is cool or whatever. And then after you're doing the thing that they want you to do, you start to looking for reasons why you should be doing, and then you look for reasons why do you actually wear a seatbelt? Yeah, because it's safer, or whatever. I think the last 2 years have provided some really good examples here. Why do we wear face masks? Because it's safer.
Yes.
Even though well, the science is dubious. But and I think it's really refreshing to look at that way of different way at learning, that it's not necessarily the information that comes first, but it's maybe a second thing that we look for after we've changed behavior. so and then, can we connect that to just culture? Well, maybe. But I stand by my answer. I think just culture is just a good thing in itself, if applied properly and not as a fine term to punish people. Now we've gone through due process and you're sacked anyway. That's, well, I know that there are organizations that do it that way.
Thank you, Carsten. That was a very, very good summary. Um, Rosa, what's your view? Is just culture desirable for learning? Just to conclude the session. You're muted, Rosa. You're muted.
I agree with Carsten that it is desirable, but I don't believe that the way it's being used or understood is really what helps people learn. So it seems to me like just another program or theme that the safety world has put together, again, separating itself from the whole, which, because learning capacity determines your ability to adapt and survive. So any organization that doesn't want to support that in their people, regardless of whether it's related to safety or any other aspect, a salesperson takes risks every moment going out. First of all, driving is a huge risk, but then talking to strangers and selling, that those are risks that we don't usually think about. I mean, are you aware right now on this forum that you're taking a risk? Do you feel that within you? Or are you so comfortable now that you don't realize that you're taking a risk? Or maybe you don't care what other people are going to think of you or say about your performance, but you're still taking a huge risk being on this forum. And most people won't do that. They just will not say what's on their mind. They won't really reveal what they really think or who they are. So I think it's desirable, but like most of what we work on, it's so superficial that it's a program. It's a program until you're able to get down into where people really live. And for me, that can only be done through the leaders that are with that group of people.
Yeah.
The key to me, leadership.
I hear you. You seem to have it's an interesting view that how much the leaders can influence the culture. But I see where you're coming from, Rosa. That's an interesting viewpoint. Thank you. Yes. Steve, what's your view on this question? Is just culture desirable for learning?
Well, justice is necessary for any group to survive. Otherwise, there's chaos, because without justice creates some kind of order that we kind of know what will happen if we do X, Y, or Z. Yeah. If you watch a documentary of a lioness and her cubs, and you see how the cubs behave as they're growing up, that even at that level, they have it. So it's there anyway, and it's necessary for order, and that would seem to be necessary for learning. Again, it's all in the implementation. What do we mean by it? Can we agree that that things go wrong? Can we agree that is not a simple cause of people making mistakes? Can we agree that people will always make mistakes, and there needs to be protections in place to protect the people also making the mistakes, such as the train driver, who's the one at the front of the train, the first one to hit another train, for instance? Can we agree that performance varies and that's necessary? Can we agree that things will go wrong? Can we agree, therefore, that when things go wrong, the people who are at positions of making decisions under uncertainty and complexity are not necessarily blameworthy for their goodwill performance? Can we agree on some basic things like that? I think that's the question. We don't really need to use the word culture. That's just obfuscates everything. What are the agreements that we can make? Write them down. Don't commodify it. That just ruins it, as far as I'm concerned.
It's very powerful. When I interviewed small little kids, 10 years old kids in the school a couple of months ago, just to understand their view on what is learning. most of the responses were, one of the responses stuck with me, and there were themes around it, to increase my brain size, to get more information, to find a proper job. Not one student came up with the idea of fallibility. Not one student. So this idea of making mistakes, and learning from mistakes, I think it's so rooted in the in our upbringing that no, you just cannot make a mistake. So interesting perspective, Steve. Thank you. Tanya, would you like to summarize your thoughts on this question? Is just culture desirable for learning?
So maybe I'll come up with another story that kind of pulls, I think, some of this together. Carsten had said that at the root of all of this, if somebody is harmed, like, somebody's to blame for this. Like, if somebody is harmed, now what? And this is rooted in the just world hypothesis that we might have to start questioning. I think his name is Anthony Ray Hinton, and I know him because he ran the Death Row Book Club, which is fascinating on its own, to being on death row and starting a book club. And he had chosen a book that an 18-year-old white death row inmate had never read, and written by, and I'm not going to, James Baldwin, I think, who, a Black author who, this 18-year-old who lynched people, Black people, because he was told to in his upbringing and things, was absolutely stunned in reading this book, because he had been told that Black people are illiterate, that they're useless, that they're a scourge to society. That Anthony Ray Hinton befriended this kid because he realized this kid wasn't raised with love. He was raised with hate. He was not actually a bad person, but he adapted, as we all said. He adapted to his environment, and he grew to hate, which ended him up on, and he was executed for his crimes. Anthony Ray Hinton wasn't, which is why we know this story, because he was exonerated. And Anthony Ray Hinton says that kid was in a world of hate. Where was Child Protective Services in that environment? If we have structures in society to protect the vulnerable, what are they doing? Not going to places that breed hate and taking the kids out of that environment. I think these last couple of years, where we've had a whole bunch of movements that have questioned the status quo. Not, you had said, Nippin, that sometimes the status quo is okay, and that's fine, but sometimes it isn't. And when it isn't, I think we have to start questioning some of the normal things that we have accepted in our society. And I just leave it with that just culture sometimes becomes a tick box exercise, which totally defeats the whole purpose. And learning is something that I think we need to engage in, both at a personal level, in self-awareness, and starting to be far more curious about how we have seen the world and how we can see the world going forward, and to share that kind of insight to a broader sphere so that we can get to a better societal place overall.
Thank you, Tanya. That was very thought-provoking. We are at the end of the session. Does anyone else have anything to add before we call it off?
I would like to thank you for putting this group together. Every single person was brought new learning into my life. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Yes. Sorry, Carsten, you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to second what Rosa said.
It's 8:00.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's been a wonderful journey.
The good work.
Yes, likewise, all of you have been doing fantastic work. So thank you. Thank you for joining, everyone. And we'll hope to see you again for the 5th session soon. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I will just stop the broadcasting. There it is.